Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Chapel and York webinar, Understanding Tax and Legal Benefits for Fundraising in the USA and Canada. I am Arnaud Marcilhacy, Head of International Fundraising at Chapel and York. And today we have four great speakers. We have Nancy Bikson, our Managing Director. Nancy, would you say a few words to introduce yourself?
Hello all, I'm a US qualified lawyer. I've been doing working with charities and international charities fundraising in the US, Canada, and around the world for the last 35 years.
Thank you. We have Heather Hill, our Head of International Philanthropy. Heather?
Yes, hello everyone. So I've been working in the philanthropic sector for over 20 years now, both locally, I should say domestically in the US as well as internationally, working with different countries around the globe. So happy to share a bit of insight and expertise today.
Thank you. And we have Ligia Pena, our Canadian Foundation Executive. Bonjour, Ligia.
Bonjour, hello everybody. Lovely to see you here. I'm the Executive Director of the Chapel and York Canada Foundation. I've been in the nonprofit sector for nearly 25 years now, and I'm also a fundraising consultant in legacies.
Thank you very much. And finally, we have Paul D'Alessandro, our US Foundation Executive. Paul?
Hi, I'm Paul D'Alessandro. I'm based outside of New York City and head the US Foundation, as Arnaud said. I've been working in the nonprofit sector for 35 years as a fundraising consultant, mostly around major gifts, capital campaigns. I'm also a US-based attorney.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, guys. It's going to be an exciting webinar as usual. Before we begin, just a few words about Chapel and York for those of you who don't know us yet. We've been around for about 25 years in the world. We helped raise $1 billion. We have over 450 clients. We have a unique team of 37 fundraising experts all over the world. And we have 6 umbrella foundations to help you raise funds abroad. One in the US, one in Canada, one in the UK, one in the Netherlands, and soon France and Spain, one in Switzerland, and one in Hong Kong. Now we're going to begin. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat, and I will ask our speakers. And we will start with Nancy. Nancy?
Thank you. Thank you, Arnaud. Thank you all very much for coming, and do please feel free to ask questions because we want you to get the most out of this possible. I'm going to start really basically here, and that is with what the situation in America is. In the States, a donor gets a tax deduction for a donation to an American 501c3, an income tax deduction. And when I talk about a donor, by the way, Americans pay tax in the US, or liable to tax, because of their citizenship. So if you've got them in your country, if you're talking to Americans, a US tax deduction may still be very interesting for them. And in fact, our UK and US foundations are linked so that Americans in the UK can get gift aid, which is the UK tax benefit, plus a US tax deduction for the same donation. The way it works is that the donors make the donations. We send them a receipt to say they've made the donations, and then it reduces the amount of tax they pay because it reduces the amount of income on which they pay tax. So it's pretty straightforward. The things you need to know about it is, one, most of your donors will know what their tax position is. I mean, taxes it's really something which is known a lot in America. So they will probably know more about their own position than you will, but it's still useful. But you need to be able to offer a tax deduction because if nothing else, you're competing with US charities for, the charitable donations. And Heather's going to talk about, what the possibilities are so that you can offer these tax deductions. Secondly, Americans get tax deductions on giving just about anything. So it's money, it's shares. Shares are very popular because people get a tax deduction on the fair market value of the shares and avoid paying capital gains tax. I mean, they have given things like clothes and land and personal property and all sorts of things. And there is something in America called planned giving, which is a very sophisticated way that people with a lot of money might want to give, where they get some benefits as well as getting tax deductions. So planned giving in America is not what some countries look at it as regular giving. It is it's a very sophisticated thing and something we can help you with as well. So that's kind of a really fast way through individuals. They have to get to a 501c3. We'll look at the options of how you deal with that. If they leave money in a will, in America they're called bequests, they can leave money directly to a non-US entity, but most US lawyers, like Paul, like me, etc., would prefer the money to go to a 501c3, which then gives the money to you, because if there's a problem with the donation, it can't be undone. So, but it is possible for a charitable donation to be left in a bequest, and it's even to an external thing. Foundations in America, you've all, Ford Foundation, the Gates Foundation, all those foundations, all those private foundations, they do not pay tax because they themselves are a 501c3. So the tax deduction was taken when the donors put the money into the foundation. When a foundation is giving, they have legal responsibilities, and they have to give away at least 5% of their of what they've got every year. They don't go out of business in 20 years because they revalue every year, but they have to do that. If they don't, they get taxed. If they give to what's called non-qualifying distributions, then they get taxed. So they want to get rid of 5% in qualifying distributions. So a qualifying distribution is to a 501c3 public charity, which means they've had a lot of donations and things from different people. They can give directly to a non-US entity, but they have to ensure that the non-US entity is like a US public charity, and that means an equivalency determination, usually signed off on by a US lawyer, to say that both you are constituted, so your legal constitution is like an American one, and you also get lots of donations from different people. So when you're talking to a foundation, it's not about talking about tax deductions, it's about meeting their legal requirements. And again, we'll talk to you about some workarounds of how you deal with that. Companies obviously can make donations and they can expense them as expenses. They can also make do charitable philanthropy, and they can get a tax deduction for doing so. Corporations are often extremely complicated, as we all know. And again, the best thing there for you is that they will know generally what their own position is. So it's for you to be able to say, look, if you want to give from a US budget, we've got this solution, which we'll talk about. If you want to give from something else, we can probably work with you for that as well. But again, they will know what their positions are. You don't need to worry about that. So that is, in 10 minutes, the fastest ever discussion of US tax stuff. The crucial takeaways for this are, though, that I think everybody is pretty aware that US tax deductions exist for individuals, and it's important to understand that foundations don't do that. it's also an important takeaway. It's just that they will sort of know their own tax position. You don't have to worry about that. What we have to worry about, what you have to worry about is being able to offer those tax benefits so that, again, you are not having at a disadvantage and having to compete with people, other charities in the States that can offer that benefit. You want to be able to attract donations because of what you do and who you are and the value of what you're offering, without there being this blockage of being able to offer the tax benefits. So we'll talk to you again, my colleagues will talk to you about the specifics of how you can do that, but that's the sort of basics you need to understand about the US tax system.
Thank you, Nancy. Now let's go up north to Canada and see how it works in Canada. Ligia?
Hi, everyone. So in Canada, it's somewhat similar with some differences, obviously. So a charitable donation, in order for it to be considered charitable, it has to meet certain criteria. First of all, there has to be a transfer of property. So the transfer of property could be cash, could be goods, could be assets, could be real estate, all of that. So that's the first thing. There needs to be arm's length, and it has to be voluntary. So what that means is that anything that is considered services do not qualify because there's no actual transfer of property. So right there with that definition, this is what is considered a charitable donation, and therefore makes it eligible for a tax receipt. Now, receipting is slightly different than in the US. So first of all, individuals receive a tax credit. And what that means is that the credit that an individual benefits from, it reduces the income tax that they have to pay at the end of the fiscal year when they file their annual tax return. For businesses and corporations, they receive a tax deduction. And what that means is that it reduces the taxable income on the business or the corporation. Okay, so there's a different, the difference is that where businesses get the deduction at the beginning, individuals get it at the end on their income. So that's a very important distinction. And lastly, donation from foundations are not eligible for a tax receipt because they're also registered charities. And according to the Income Tax Act, charities cannot issue tax receipts to other charities. The reason being is that registered charities do not file income tax. So that is considered fraud. So therefore, we cannot issue tax receipt. But what we do, however, is send a letter of acknowledgement to confirm that the donation was received, etc. So for instance, if ever a foundation that you've been engaging with in Canada says, well, we transferred the funds, but we did not receive a tax receipt, you can say, well, that's the reason why. But of course, most of them do know this already, and we do send an acknowledgement. Now, the key, and perhaps something that I get asked a lot, is often, what's the tax credit that an individual will benefit from? And of course, this is where things get a little bit more complicated, not because the calculation is difficult, because it's actually quite simple. It's that in Canada, we pay federal tax, but then depending on the province that you live in, you also pay provincial tax. So for instance, I live in Quebec, outside of Montreal. And so I file tax return at the federal level and at the provincial level. People in Ontario, for instance, where probably the majority of your donors reside, will only file a combined tax return to the federal government, which then gets trickled down to the Ontario. So our credits that we can claim on our income tax get calculated a certain percentages at the federal level and a certain percentage at the provincial level. So what I've done is I've created a cheat sheet, and it's going to outline all of this, and it's got hyperlinks. So it'll tell you where your donors are Like if you've got donors in Alberta, this is the tax credit that they would get on their income tax. So usually it's a percentage for the first $200 of the gift, and then a different percentage for the total of tax credit donations above the 200 mark. And of course, you know, I can't tell you exactly how much a credit would be because it depends also on the taxable income that they have to pay. Having said that, what's really neat about our taxation system is that a donor can carry forward their tax receipts for their charitable tax receipt for up to 5 years. So what that means is that if 1 year, if they really want to maximize that credit, they can hold on to their tax receipts up until 5 years until they have a much bigger total amount. So if, let's say year one, I only made $100 donation, I wouldn't get the full tax credit because it's a very low amount. But if I accumulate them and I wait until year 5, and at year 5, I've made a total of all donations to your charity and all the other charities I donate, if that comes up to $5,000, for instance, then that on year 5, when I claim that in my income tax, I will get a much bigger tax credit, and that's much more attractive. So that's really a fun thing to consider. Like Nancy said, we also have a very robust plan giving program, legacy giving, actually. Gifts and wills, and I'm going to be completely biased because this is my area of expertise, is the best thing you could possibly offer to your donors if you're serious about financial sustainability for decades. And so what's really interesting in Canada is that all of the tax receipts that a donor has at year of death can be used to up to 100% of their income that year. So what am I talking about? When you're living, you can claim charitable tax receipt up to 75% of your income, of your declared income. So there's a limitation. How many people actually reach that max? Are very few. I mean, you have to be making a lot of donations. At year of death, it's 100%. So this is when you really want to front load all those tax credits. And there's a lot of, it obviously reduces the income tax owed on the estate, which makes it very attractive for charities and for the estate. So that's my quick run through of some of the highlights of our tax regulations in Canada.
Thank you very much, Ligia. Now let's head south to somewhere in Texas with Heather, our international philanthropy, head of international philanthropy. Heather?
Yeah, so the next question is kind of understanding what the tax benefits are. How do you offer those to your donors in those countries? So I can talk through this a little bit. One option is that you can set up a separate legal entity in that country, whether that's the US or Canada. I'll speak about the US as an example of what that might look like. So in the US, that would be setting up a 501c3 charitable organization. If you want to do this, this is not a quick, easy, simple solution. So understanding what that entails is very important because it's not the only option. We'll talk about what other options are, but a lot of charities and organizations default to this because it's the one that's most talked about. Oh, I'll just have a charity in the US. To have a 501c3 charity in the United States, you have to first apply to the Internal Revenue Service, the IRS. But before you can even apply to the IRS for this, you have to have a lot of other things in place. There are a number of documents and other things you have to have before you're even ready to complete the application. So for example, something that defines the purpose of what your charitable organization will do, how it will be run, how it will be governed, who's responsible for the governance, how are those people selected, and of those who are doing the governance work, how are the officers or directors chosen? And that leads into, you have to have a board for your US entity. So a consideration as you're thinking about having a charity is, do we have people in the US or in whatever country you're looking at who are willing to sit on a board for this entity? And in the US, the requirements, you have to have a minimum of 3 people. You really should be thinking about having 6 or 9 people that would be willing to do this, because you've got to think about succession. If someone no longer has a time and steps down, if someone moves, if someone takes a different job and they say, look, I can't do this anymore, do you have someone who's willing to take on that governance responsibility for your other entity? In addition to having a board, you've got to think about administrative things. So where would people send post if they wanted to mail something to the entity? What about setting up a bank account so that you have a place to receive the donations? How are you going to receive donations? Are you going to be processing checks? Are you taking online gifts? Would you receive gifts of shares? And in that case, would you have a brokerage account? All these different things that you would have to have set up in place. And then who's responsible for opening the post, for doing the donation processing, for issuing the tax receipts or gift acknowledgements? There are a lot of factors to be considering when you're looking at having a separate legal entity. It is quite possible, but it's a lot of the cost is not just the fees, it's also the time that's invested, not just for you, but for those who would be involved in the governance. And so the other thing to think about as well is once you've got that entity, and then there are legal and regulatory bits that you need to be following for it. So annual filings, if you receive revenue over a certain amount, you might need to have an independent audit done of your financials and have those submitted as well. There are a lot of different aspects of having an entity. So even if it's just an entity with a 3-person board, it doesn't mean it's a simple thing to do. So there are organizations like Chapel in New York who can take that legal, regulatory, administrative burden for you and do the setup of the entity, can run the entity for you. But again, I think one key point is, do you want to have an in-country presence, and do you plan on being in that country for multiple years? To really kind of look at what's the return on investment of having a separate legal entity, whether that's the US or in Canada. The other option that you have, if you want to offer tax benefits to your donors in the US or Canada, is to work with an intermediary. So working with a charity that's already in that country who can accept gifts from donors in that country, issue the tax receipt. That entity is then responsible for all the legal and regulatory and administrative bits like the donation processing and receiving an acknowledgement. I will hand it off to Paul to speak a little bit about what that looks like in the US, using the Chapel in New York US Foundation as an example.
Thank you, Heather. Before we go to Paul in New York City, Nancy, would you like to add a few words?
Yes, thank you. I think it's really important to understand in America, because this is really something different from other countries. That when an American donor gives to a 501c3, whether it's your own that you've set up, as Heather was talking about, or even the Chapel in New York Foundation that Paul's going to talk about, the 501c3 cannot be a conduit of money from the donor to you. The board has, the reason why is because there's no tax deduction if the money goes directly outside of the country. So the sort of quid pro quo with the IRS is that the board of this 501c3 that you're using, even if it's one you've set up, has to make an affirmative decision each time to grant the money to you. So you can't set up just regular payments over to you from the 501c3, whether it's your own or ours. The board always has to make those decisions. And it makes it a little bit trickier if you're trying to do something where you've already had a lot of conversation with the donor about funding a chair or a new program or something. There's a lot of legal things that go on behind the scenes with that. It obviously in 25 years, that's a lot of what we do, is to make certain that all of that's correct. But along with the 501c3 not being a conduit, donors can't actually earmark the funds for use abroad. Now that may sound absolutely stupid when you think about the fact that this whole conversation is about how to support non-US entities that are fundraising in America. It is absolutely doable to do exactly what we're talking about doing, setting up something or using this and getting the money through. But it's all about the way people say it, what they say it, how they say it. So the donor has to suggest the money to be used for a particular purpose, or the donor has to suggest the fund it wants to go to, etc. They cannot earmark it, and that does do a bit of things. It's all been, this has been going on for years. It's absolutely it's pretty standard stuff. There are details about all of this though that I just want to make sure that you're aware of, so that when you are getting into it, at least you understand that it's not just set up a 501c3 and for example, and then you just go out and get the money and you send it back to yourself. It is all completely doable. There are lots of American Friends organizations, and they've been operating for years, quite successfully. I would say probably it's getting a little bit less exciting to have your own at the moment because things like the banking and the other regulatory issues are making it more difficult and painful to have your own. But for the right organizations, it's certainly doable, worth doing, and and we can support that. Anyway, sorry. Arnaud, back over to you.
Thank you, Nancy. Heather, you want to add something?
Yes, I want to affirm everything Nancy just said, that separation is incredibly important. There has to be a process for the board making active decisions before any funds would be going to the entity abroad. Another aspect of that as well is you can't have, this is why we're talking about the importance of, do you have people in country to be on the board? Because the people in your organization situated outside the US or Canada, they can't be your board members. And if they are on your board, they can't be active voting members because you have to show that the foreign entity is independent from, particularly talking about the US, from the US entity. So if you've got, you can't have, say, the director of development for a university in the UK sitting on that university's board for the US 501c3 unless they're only there in an ex officio capacity and are abstaining from any votes or discussions on how funds will be granted back to granted to the university. So that's the other important bit about thinking about, do you have people who could sit on your board for you that are in country, because the IRS will scrutinize who's in control of the organization, and they want to see that that US entity is operating separately and independently from any organization abroad. Again, that makes it very clear that it's not a conduit or a pass-through entity, but there are in-country people who are receiving the donations and making decisions on how they'll be used.
Thank you, Heather. Paul, you want to give us your view?
Sure, and thank you all. I'm grateful for this team with such a strong knowledge base, because that makes everything work. And I just want to say at the outset, in the US, there's over 1.5 million charities that are registered 501c3s, and it's all regulated federally, and then it's regulated at the state level. So as Heather and Nancy stated, it's very complex, and in part you need an attorney and you need a CPA to deal with all the different issues. Now, as the head of the US Foundation for Chapel in New York, this simplifies so much for our fund holders. And of course, it's a decision whether you, as Nancy and Heather said, whether you want to have a separate 501c3 with all the complexities around it, or whether you wanted to become a fund holder within the US Foundation at Chapel in New York. And one of the things that, the primary thing I think, is that all those things that we talked about that are complex in terms of audits and regulations and state registrations is all addressed by the US Foundation as a fund holder within the foundation, which goes to the extent of the receipting of gifts, because it has all 501c3s. Any gifts that come into a separate 501c3, the donors have to do a receipt. So if you're a fund holder within the US, your donors will get a receipt. The other thing too that was stated is, when you work with Chapel in New York in the US, you don't have to worry about the banking regulations. You know, we run across the two-factor authorization. If you're overseas, you probably won't be able to do that. And there's so many aspects of it. Also, we do our due diligence and we have a number of fund holders on all the charitable entities and projects overseas to make sure they're in compliance with the Anti-Money Laundering Act and what have you. So that's a very important piece of the puzzle as well. And, you know, I'm happy to say that as I speak to more and more overseas nonprofits, you know, the question is, you know, can I raise money in the United States? And the answer is yes. And perhaps Arnaud could speak about that more. And, you know, can you help us make this easier? And the answer is yes. So, you know, as a head of the U.S. Foundation, where a number of gifts are coming in from donors, from foundations, U.S. foundations, from private foundations, from corporations, from individual donors, whether it's art, assets, stock, cash, we address all of it. And then we make sure that the board meets and with the suggestions are awarded the grants that they need. And then, you know, Heather and Nancy have been at this a long time too, and I'm sure they might want to add something if you do.
Thank you, Paul. Actually, can we go back to you, Heather, and could you tell us a little more about how the foundation works, like the basics?
Yes. So again, this is the framework of working with an intermediary. So working with the registered 501(c) in the US. So you as a charity would apply for a fund with the foundation. And then your donors in the US can make donations to your fund directed to the Chapel in New York US Foundation. So the foundation receives that donation, receipts the donor, and then the Chapel in New York US Foundation has a board. The board meets quarterly, and much as we were talking about in the example of having a separate 501(c)(3), the same process has to apply for the Chapel in New York US Foundation, where the board reviews the donations that have come in and makes approvals for the granting. So they look at the suggested use of funds, and then they make a decision about granting. So then the US Foundation would grant the funds to those organizations that were fund holders once the board has approved them. So again, the foundation takes the administrative burden away from the entity abroad, as well as handling all the legal and regulatory bits. So all the fund holders really having to do is go through the application process and annually report back on how funds have been used. The foundation needs to ensure that the funds are being used for the stated charitable purposes that were given at the time the entity joined as a fund holder. So it's a very it's a far more seamless process if you're the organization abroad versus having to deal with your own entity in country. And again, it's very seamless for the donor as well. They're just simply making the gift to the US Foundation, getting their donation receipt, and off they go. One thing that we've talked about with these tax benefits is that, of course, tax benefits aren't the reason that a donor gives. They give because they care about you, your cause, the work that you're doing. But tax benefits can have a significant influence on the types of gifts a donor will give, as well as the amount. It can be a nice motivator, especially, and Nancy was talking about shares earlier, if they have shares or other assets that have appreciated in value, to be able to donate those to a qualified charity and receive a tax deduction is a significant benefit. You can receive a lot of major gifts that way, and major gifts in general are more likely if the donor has the opportunity to claim a tax benefit. So again, finding the simple, seamless way for them to do that. And the US Foundation is a great example of how that can be done and working with an intermediary versus through a separate entity.
Thank you, Heather. Ligia, can you tell us a little more about the Canadian Foundation and what's unique about Canada?
Well, we are unique, of course. So the Canada Foundation differs on a few things from all the other Chapel in New York foundations, in that because we have a very regulated system which has protected the Canadian economy and legal system quite a bit. It means that the Canada Revenue Agency has very strict rules about donations raised in Canada by Canadian taxpayers that leaves our borders. So any organization that wants to join the Canada Foundation will see that there's a few differences with the other foundations, in that, first of all, the terminology. What I mean by that is all the other foundations at Chapel New York refer to their members as fund holders. Well, in Canada, we can't call them that because they're not fund holders. They're actually agents. And what that means is that the Canadian government views any organization outside of its borders that partners with a Canadian charity, i.e. the Canada Foundation, as an agent that helps our foundation deliver its charitable purposes. So basically, in layman's term, it's a service agreement. It's a service agreement between the Canada Foundation and your organization to deliver your work under our charitable purposes. And so that's why with my foundation, you'll be referred to as an agent. We also don't make grants because you're not a grantee, you're actually a service provider. So we make payments to your organization so that you can deliver our charitable purposes. Between you and me, it all ends up being the same thing. It's just that the terminology needs to be done differently. So we're very careful because obviously we want to remain compliant to regulations. And so the terminology will be different. But at the end of the day, the way we operate and the way we review at board meetings, the way we review the donations that have come in, and the way we process the donations are still the same as every other foundation at Chapel in New York.
Thank you very much, Ligia. We're coming to the end of our webinar. Nancy, you want to conclude?
Right. Well, I don't know if we have any questions that anybody wants answered, but we're absolutely delighted if you do want to stick something into the chat. Thank you very much. It is important to understand the tax and legal stuff of what's going on when you're fundraising. I mean, obviously. And it is not easy when you're trying to do it in a country that you don't know, and one which is complex and very it's highly regulated. But then all charities, all nonprofits around the world are highly regulated. It's just the regulations are different in every country. But in America, it's a very mature market. For you to be fundraising there, absolutely go for it. But make sure that you know what you're doing in terms of at least this bit. That's the first step before any kind of fundraising campaign, is to ensure that you have something that you can say to your donors that will offer them the tax benefits that they would expect. And whether that's setting up your own, whether that's using a foundation. I mean, we set up the Chapel in New York Foundations as a really good alternative with a lot of services that make sense. So, when as Paul was talking about, we send a receipt to the donor, you get a copy of that, so you know that a donation has come in, so you can steward the donation. When grants are made to you, who's made those grants, etc. I mean, stewarding donors abroad is hard enough, but it's important that obviously that you're fulfilling all the fundraising things that you would ordinarily do. But anyway, the tax and legal stuff, we've tried to give you a little bit of an overview and how it applies to you outside America. We're very happy to answer any specific questions you have. Any of us here would be delighted to answer any questions. I think we will be sending everybody a video or a transcript of this, so that's great. Feel free to be in touch with any of us if you have a specific question. There's been some really interesting things that people have done in America, and there's no reason why your organization shouldn't be part of that. Same thing with Canada. Ligia runs a very brilliant operation up north of the American border. We're very, and we know that there's a lot of Canadian interest in the rest of the world. It's a much smaller market, but it's a very international one. So, you know, on behalf of Chapel York, we're absolutely delighted that you've come. We hope that this has been something which is has been of interest, maybe told you something you didn't really know before, or something that you weren't sure about. But again, please be in touch. We're absolutely delighted to hear from anybody.
Thank you, Nancy. We actually have a question from Luke. Our 501c3 has in its article specific reference to supporting heritage properties in the UK. Presumably, a donor can restrict their donation to support the named activity and suggest that the funds be given to the UK charity to carry out the work.
Yeah, it's one of the really bizarre things, because it doesn't feel like it should work, that you can have articles that say the money is going to support something in the UK. They should never be earmarked. So they need to give the money to you, and they need to suggest that the funds be used for such and such a purpose by such and such a charity. The key is that the board of the 501c3 says, what a great idea. We would love for that to happen, and the money is granted there. So the keys are the suggestion, and that the board agrees with that suggestion and makes the grant.
Thank you.
Yeah, and just to that point, it has to be a suggestion, not a restriction. I know that Luke used the word, a donor can restrict. The donor can't restrict, the donor can suggest.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
So can donors not restrict donations to 501c3s operating in the US? If you're giving to the Met, can you not say this has to be spent on this particular gallery?
In the US, it's easy because it's in the US. It's when it comes outside America, the rules change, and you can't be a conduit, and you cannot earmark funds for use abroad. So that's why you have to suggest it, and the board needs to make a decision.
So should our articles be rewritten, because they're very specifically about supporting the work here?
That's fine, because it could be a US charity which is doing things in the UK. So there's no problem with the articles. Once they've gone through, that's fine. They've been looked at by the IRS. It's the operation then that becomes the important thing of how you do it.
I see. Thank you.
Thank you, Luke. One question from Sebastian. What are the regulations in the USA and Canada around providing stewardship benefits to donors? Is there a maximum value of benefits a charity can provide to still be tax efficient?
Wow, well, that's raising a whole lot of questions on this. In fact, US entities, US charities can provide benefits. I'm not sure if that's what you mean by stewardship, but they can provide benefits to donors. If they're de minimis, if there's under certain value, the donor doesn't have to take them in account. So that's the famous tote bags and mugs with names of the charities on that they get over there. If it's a bigger donor, if it's a bigger benefit, like you get to go on a backstage tour, the charity has to disclose that to the donor, and the donor has to reduce the tax deduction by the amount of the benefit they receive. There's whole bunches of rules around that. It's a really strange issue if you give it through our, for example, US Foundation, because it's not the US Foundation that's offering the benefit, but that's something we'd still be talking about. So as long as the benefits are not more than sort of 50% of the donation, you just reduce the amount of donation, the value of the benefit. I'm sorry, the value of the tax deduction by the benefit.
Thank you.
From the Canadian, can I answer the Canadian side?
Sure.
From the Canadian perspective, what I want to focus first and foremost is the language used. Stewardship is one thing, recognition is another. And I think this is the question you're really asking, Sebastian, is the recognition. Because stewardship is one thing that is engaging with the donor, having conversations, inviting them to the organization, inviting them to view videos of what you're doing abroad, etc. So that's stewardship. Recognition, however, is, you know, putting publications of the name on website, on paraphernalia, on solicitations, on anything that's public, right? So so I think that's what you're referring to here. There are rules. There are definitely rules. When I was talking earlier about what qualifies as a donation, one criteria that I missed and I didn't mention was that there cannot be an expectation of benefit. So what that means is, from an individual, if they expect to have their name all over a building, there are regulations about that. But those are few and far between, right? That we wouldn't do that kind of donation at the Canada Foundation. And I'm not going to get into the reasons why, because it gets more complex and I don't want to lose everybody. But what this usually affects the most are businesses and corporations. And so when a corporation decides to make a large donation to a charity and expects to have, you know, their brand written all over the place and all that kind of stuff, then that falls under their marketing budget, and that is not that is not eligible for a charitable tax receipt. So depending on what the terms and who the donor is, it'll get handled differently.
Thank you, Ligia. Yeah, go ahead.
We were saying, Arnaud, that just to go to the US side of what Ligia was saying, you know, putting names on a building and all that sort of stuff is quite regular and wouldn't reduce the tax benefit unless there was some benefit back. But you can certainly give a donation in America, get a tax deduction, even if you're expecting some sort of benefit back. It will just reduce the amount of tax deduction.
Super. Any other comments? All right. So I think we're wrapping up. It was really great. Thank you very much. If we can help you, we are here to help you. If it's about fundraising, I'm the one to talk to, Arnaud Marcilhacy. Look at our website, go on LinkedIn. We're really happy to answer any question and, as I said, help you the best way we can. We have another webinar scheduled on April 25th, and it's going to be about tax and legal in Asia, and I think it's going to be very interesting too. So thank you, everyone, and hopefully we'll see you at the end of April. And please get in touch and don't hesitate to ask questions, and if we can help you, pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.